The interesting thing about greed is that when one brings it up, the assumption that often follows is that one is talking about an all-consuming desire for money, as I'm pretty sure that's where your mind went to when you saw the title and thumbnail for this video. And if you've watched The Mummy an inordinate and quite frankly worrying number of times like I have, then your mind probably already made the connection to Beni and the treasure hunters and are wondering why you should give me 25 minutes of your precious time just for me to state the obvious. However, that isn't the case. Not exactly anyway. Because you see, the 1999 film The Mummy, with its super attractive cast of Brenda Fraser, Rachel Weisz, Arnold Vosloo, John Anna, and Adeth Bey, is indeed a cautionary tale about greed and the variety it contains, as seen reflected in a lot of its characters. Some are greedy for money, some for love, some for power, some for knowledge, some for death. And I personally find it ironic that although this film wants its characters to be more moderate in their desires, I, the person who is making this video, knows no moderation in my love and obsession for The Mummy and The Mummy Returns, and I'm quite pleased and content in my greed for them. What can I say? I'm a hypocrite. So I'll start this conversation about greed and its centrality to the story told in The Mummy by immediately thinking of what is so integral to the movie that it kicks off the main story. I'm of course referring to Seti I, Imhotep, and Anck-su-Namun all being greedy for love, which is at the core of the tragedy that has the three of them interwoven in a tight grip. Seti I loves Anck-su-Namun, or at least he desires her to a forsake all reason extent. Imhotep loves her to the point of obsession, and Anck-su-Namun, whilst mistress to the most powerful man in Egypt, loves Imhotep instead, who happens to be Seti I's right-hand man and friend of some sort, and is also the chief priest of Osiris. It is a tale as old as time, of betrayals and friendships destroyed, all for the love of a woman, of hearts that cannot be controlled or reasoned with, and a love that makes fools of us all. Like I said, it is a tale as old as time, and history is littered to the brim with stories of much older men who fall hopelessly in love with women who are much younger than them, young, beautiful women who they convince themselves in their greed love them back. Like, I'm not about to state categorically that all young, beautiful women who are with men old enough to be their fathers or grandfathers do not love them. I'm just saying that for a lot of these women, love isn't the main factor, and it is greed that would have you, a much older man, convince yourself that this young beautiful woman, of all the men in the world that she could choose, chose you out of love. It is Delulu to the extreme Delulu, and the story punishes Seti I for that hubris and greed. The Mummy Returns establishes for us that Anck-su-Namun is about the same age as Princess Nefertiti, who is Seti I's daughter, and Nefertiti notices the cow eyes that Anck-su-Namun makes at Imhotep, which means as at when Seti I takes on Anck-su-Namun as his mistress, she was already in love with another man. Greed is what makes a ruler exercise the absolute power he has to take as his own any woman he wants. Greed, the desire to possess said woman, is what would make him have every inch of her skin painted so that he can ensure that he and only he is able to touch her. But of course, in this entire debacle, Seti I isn't the only one who is greedy for and in love. Imhotep also exhibits that as well. He falls in love and is willing to betray his oath to his liege by having an affair with a woman who is meant to be Seti I and only Seti I. And Anck-su-Namun is greedy enough to fall in love with Imhotep, whilst at the same time thinking that she can still maintain her position as Seti I's mistress. Because trust me, if he hadn't noticed the smudge on her arm that confirmed that he was not the only one touching her, my girl would most likely have carried on with the ruse. After all, neither Anck-su-Namun nor Imhotep were expecting Seti I to show up for a surprise visit. But he did, and they killed him as a result. And we know how the rest of that opening sequence plays out. Anck-su-Namun sends Imhotep off with the hope that it would bring her back to life, and then commits suicide in the presence of the Magi, telling them that Seti I is no longer going to get the chance to touch her again. Imhotep races off to Amun-Aptra, the city of the dead, so he can fulfill his promise to Anck-su-Namun and raise her from the dead. It's clearly putting his Osiris' priest abilities to proper use here, and although I understand the why of it, it does still speak to Imhotep being both greedy for love and greedy for power as well. In this case, power over life and death. Because it says a lot that a human, priest to Osiris though he may be, believes himself powerful enough and sees nothing wrong in reaching for that power and wielding it purposefully to bring back the soul of his lover from the underworld. It speaks to both his hubris as a human and his greed as well. He is willing to go to any lengths to acquire the Black Book of the Dead and Anck-su-Namun's buried body so he can perform the ritual. This greed is so disrespectful to his position and to the God he serves, as in attempting to carry out this act, he places himself somewhat on equal footing with the God of the dead, Osiris himself. What is it, if not greed, that would make Imhotep want to place himself on such a pedestal? What is it, if not greed, that would have him, after he is accidentally brought back to life and given form, be so singularly focused in not only bringing back Anck-su-Namun, but choosing to make Evie a host for her body? Because let's be real, if it had been anybody else, Rick and Jonathan most likely would have grabbed Evie and bailed it out of Egypt. End of the world be damned. And if they had bailed, Imhotep most likely would have succeeded. Because the only reason why he failed so spectacularly in his plans is because of Rick, Evelyn, and Jonathan, those meddling kids. Oh, and Adeth Bey, of course. Can't forget about my man now, can I? And of course, I can't mention Evie without bringing up how greedy she is about and for knowledge, especially knowledge that is better left undiscovered, unexplored, and unspoken. Because let's all be collectively honest. If Evie had left the Black Book of the Dead alone, if she, after having borrowed it, hadn't decided to take it a step further to unlock it with the secret key, and even though Rick warned her about reading from the book, I mean, it is called the freaking Book of the Dead, Evie. Why read from a book that is so clearly for the dead, Evie? Especially shortly after having discovered a skeleton right beneath where you're currently standing, that you yourself describe as being fresh and juicy, Evie. Like, even if you wanted to read it at all costs, why couldn't you read it in your mind, Evie? Why read it out loud, Evie? And why have the audacity to ask what harm could come from reading a book, Evie? Just in case you all can't tell, although I love Evelyn Canahan, later Evelyn O'Connell, to hell and back again, I still think that she's directly responsible for a lot of things that happened in this movie, just because she's so desperately driven to learn more, so greedy for knowledge, that her thirst for it is practically insatiable. Sis raised a terror that the Magi had been striving to keep sealed in the tomb in which he was buried for over a millennium, because she was curious and wanted to know more, and stole something that wasn't hers to read a book that she should have sooner sewn her mouth shut than read aloud. And honestly, if we're being honest, it is the same greed and thirst for knowledge that drives Evie in the story that also drives the Egyptologist Dr. Alan Chamberlain, who accompanies the American treasure hunters to Amunaptra to seek treasure, but also to seek the Book of the Dead. Although, unlike Evie, he has enough sense to know not to read from the book. However, he doesn't have enough sense to refrain from grabbing one of the gold-encrusted canopic jars that they found alongside the Book of the Dead in a chest, even after he warned the American treasure hunters he was with that the chest, based off of what he could read, was cursed. I guess he got so carried away with his greed to open the Book of the Dead and his greed for the wealth that he would acquire from the canopic jars that his mind was wiped clean of the curse. Speaking of the treasure hunters, as expected, I can't make a video talking about how The Mummy is a cautionary tale about greed and not mention the characters who are greedy for wealth and money, and how that directly leads to the death of majority of them. Burns, Anderson, and Daniels are the American treasure hunters who, alongside Dr. Chamberlain, find the chest that has the canopic jars and the Book of the Dead, and the four of them divvy up the jars among themselves, cleanly ignoring Dr. Chamberlain's warning that the chest is cursed. It does, however, make them easy pickings and Imhotep's target, as he uses their internal organs to regenerate his body and powers, devouring them one at a time. And in their greed, none of them ever think to, I don't know, maybe drop the cursed jar or pass it on to another unsuspecting soul. Like, we all know that the curse, and by extension Imhotep, will most likely stay on them even if they hand the jar to someone else, because they are the ones who actually opened the chest. But I find it interesting, and it speaks a lot to their greed, that even until their death, they were each carrying those gold jars with them everywhere they went. It was really their greed for treasure that led to their deaths. And the same can be said of the warden, who would most likely have survived if, one, he had simply accepted the £300 that Evelyn had initially offered to him for Rick's release into hers and Jonathan's custody, so Rick could serve as their guide to Amunaptra. The warden, though, was established as a character that was greedy for more from the very start. First, he tried propositioning Evie to have sex with him in addition to giving him the £300, and when she smacks him, he angrily chooses to condemn Rick to be hanged. At least until Evie tells him about Rick knowing how to get them to Amunaptra, at which point the warden works out a deal with Evie to get a percentage of the treasures they find. And then his greed takes him a step further and has him choosing to accompany them on this journey to the city of the dead. And you know what? He most likely would have survived if his ass hadn't decided to grab some blue gold scarabs from a tomb, dreaming about all the wealth that was about to come his way when he's able to sell them, and utterly unaware that the scarabs are actually flesh-eating scarabs. Instead, he keeps plucking them from the wall, not content with one or two or a couple. My guy was going for as many as could possibly fill up his bag, and then one of those scarabs falls from his hands, lands on the floor, and makes his way into his shoe, then into his skin itself, crawling his way up to his brain. This sends the warden running and screaming until he rams into a wall and dies. This exact same thing would have happened to Jonathan when the crew gets back to Amun-Aptra to save Evie, who had been kidnapped by Imhotep at this point, so he could kill her in a ritual to resurrect the love of his life. Thankfully, Jonathan didn't grab quite the number of scarabs the warden did, because in this regard, he wasn't quite as greedy as the warden, and thus it was easy for Rick to cut the scarab out of his arm and shoot it dead. Someone else who wasn't as lucky as Jonathan, however, was Beni, Rick's fellow soldier in the French region, who was fighting side by side with Rick in Amun-Aptra against the Tuareg warriors at the very start of the movie, until he runs off in a bid of self-preservation, leaving Rick to ultimately be captured and tossed in a prison in Cairo for 3 years, until Evie and Jonathan bail him out. On their journey to Amun-Aptra, Rick runs into Beni, who he discovers is serving as a guide to the American treasure hunters, who, much smarter, chose to split Beni's payment in half for him to take them to their destination and the other half to be paid back to him when he brings them back. It is clear that the Americans have a pretty good read on Beni's greed. Unfortunately for them, they don't remember this, especially not Burns, who after Imhotep had devoured his eyes and tongue and his friends had managed to get him away from Amun-Aptra and back to Cairo, meets with Beni, who claims that he's bringing him to someone who can help heal him, until he reveals that the mystery healer is Imhotep, who is there to finish the job. And Beni then proceeds to help Imhotep capture the remaining Americans. Why does he do this? Sure, it's partly out of self-preservation, so Imhotep will not kill him, but it's mostly out of greed, as Beni has in his sights the treasures that Imhotep has promised him. It is why he betrays his former employers and even Rick again. And then there's the pilot Winston, who is greedy for death. To be more specific, a death that is valiant and worthy of him getting to join the rest of his men in his regiment who have all died in the previous war. It is this greed, this insatiable desire that has him joyfully agreeing to help Jonathan and Rick rescue Evie at Amun-Aptra when Imhotep had taken her to perform the ritual for Anck-su-Namun. And sure enough, the sandstorm that Imhotep conjures crashes the plane, and although both Rick and Jonathan escape unscathed, Winston dies in the crash, having broken his neck. And what's worse, he doesn't even get a proper burial worthy of someone who has fought battles for the honor of the crown and state, and instead falls into quicksand. He and his plane both sinking to the depths, never to be seen again, with only Rick and Jonathan present to send him off for a brief couple of seconds. Honestly, a part of me is pretty sure Winston most likely would not have minded though. He wanted death and got to go with a bang and a crash, and Winston at this point of the story didn't want to die a drunk and was most likely pleased he got to die in a crash. The total erasure of him and anything that might have been sent back home in place as a memorial of sorts for him, however, might be what he gets for being so greedy for death that he chased it even to the city of the dead. Like I said, most of these characters did get their comeuppance as a result of being driven by their greed. Rick doesn't count because honestly, he really is one of the most well-adjusted characters in the movie and isn't driven by any greed whatsoever throughout the course of the story. Evelyn and Jonathan, although express greed in the movie, are the reasons why I think The Mummy is actually more a cautionary tale about greed. Because their story arc and how it comes full circle is about them letting go of those things of which they have an excess amount of greed towards, which is what then saves them. Evie, for example, almost chooses to waste time mourning the loss of the Book of Amun-Ra or the Book of the Living after it drops in one of the pools in the tomb as they race their way out of Amun-Aptra. Her taking the time to wail and berate Jonathan for being careless and having such a precious book and piece of knowledge slip from his fingers is cut short by Rick and Jonathan reaching for her and pulling her away from the scene, just showing her breaking away from the excessive desire and greed for a book and knowledge that would otherwise have been the death of her should she remain. The same can be said for Jonathan, who in their escape takes a brief moment to look at the wealth of the pharaohs and more not being able to take any of the gold with them. Just as with Evelyn, Rick and Evelyn this time both reach out and drag him away so they can continue their race out of the tombs before they are trapped. Contrast this to Beni, who gets the chance to run away from Amun Amunaptra after having grabbed enough treasures and artifacts to set himself up for life. However, Beni goes back to grab even more treasures, not satisfied with what he had taken before. It is greed that pushes this feeling of believing that what he's taken so far is inadequate that makes him go back for more, at which point he accidentally sets off the trigger mechanism that starts the countdown for the entire tombs to collapse onto itself. And yet, even with the tombs coming down all around him, Beni still lugs all that treasure around. Is greed keeping him from dropping the treasure and running for his life? By the time he does throw away the treasure and makes the decision to run, it is already too late. And Rick, although he tries to save Beni, isn't able to do so, leaving Beni trapped behind in the tomb and thus leading to his death. I find it very ironic, and I'm sure it's purposeful of the writing to have Beni trapped in the tomb, surrounded by all the wealth of ancient Egypt which he cannot spend or live on, as he's devoured alive by the flesh-eating scarabs in the dark. Evelyn and Jonathan, by letting go of their excessive greed, are able to gain so much more at the end of the story. They walk away from Amunaptra with love, new friendships, and all the wealth that Beni had gathered before he got too greedy for his own good, went back for more, and died in those same tombs. They instead, by choosing to walk away when they did, were able to do so with so much more, unaware of the true worth of the bounty that they had acquired. And considering their lessons, they most likely wouldn't have cared because their priorities are changed. Except for maybe Jonathan. But I think it's a pretty fitting way to end all their stories in the first Mummy movie. Do you agree or disagree with me? Hit the like button if you do, hit the dislike button if you don't. The choice is yours after all, and I'm not greedy enough to assume that everyone will agree with what I have to say. If, however, you did like what I had to say and are interested in checking out my other content, do check out my playlists. I talk about movies and TV shows and anime and books, and I have been told I have some interesting perspectives. Oh, also subscribe if you want to, and do share this video if you think others should also see and hear what I have to say. All these interactions do help my channel grow and are incredibly supportive of my content. Speaking of support, a huge thank you to my patrons. Your support means the world to me and encourages me to keep making content. Thank you for helping me keep the lights on and pay my bills. If you would like to support me on Patreon as well and can afford it, do check out the link to my Patreon in the description box. I make new videos 3 times a week. Mondays are for my anime manga content, Tuesdays are for movies and TV shows, Wednesdays are for anything I want really. Videos drop at 5 p.m. EST on upload days. Whilst you wait for my next video, do check out my thoughts on the true role that gossip plays in Bridgerton. And until my next video, do remember, obsessing over the things you love, perfectly valid coping mechanism.